They thought dragging him to court would be routine. An aging black man. Worn coat. No address. No lawyer. Just another face to dismiss. But he wasn't just any man. He once led one of America's most visionary humanitarian empires, and long before that, ran through enemy fire in Fallujah to save lives. What they saw was a defendant. What they missed was a legend. Where are you watching from? Share your city in the comments. We're moved by how far these stories reach. The courtroom in Newbridge was a stark, unyielding chamber, its walls saturated with the ghosts of countless verdicts, each one etched into the cold stone like a scar. Langston Reid, 62 years old, stood before the judge's bench, his wrists clasped in the unyielding embrace of handcuffs that bit into his weathered skin. The charges, disturbing the peace and trespassing, were petty, almost mocking in their triviality, as though the law had crafted a cruel jest to belittle the towering figure it sought to confine. His frame, once broad and imposing, a testament to a life of strength, was now gaunt, swallowed by a threadbare jacket that hung loosely on his stooped shoulders, whispering of better days long gone. Seated in the defendant's chair, his eyes, deep pools of unspoken grief, traced the scuffed grain of the wooden table before him, as if the worn surface might yield answers to questions he had long ceased to voice. To the spectators crammed into the gallery, he was a stranger, a vagrant who had wandered too far from the warmth of society's embrace. They could not see the man he had been, a titan forged in fire, a hero whose light had never truly dimmed. Only days before, the police had found him crouched in the shadowed alley behind Jefferson Street Café, his breath mingling with the steam rising from a vent that offered fleeting warmth against the autumn chill. The café, a modest beacon nestled in the heart of Newbridge, was more than a place to Langston. It was a living monument to his legacy, a quiet echo of the man he had once been. Decades ago, when his name carried the weight of influence and his wealth flowed like a river, he had poured his heart into this community. He had endowed scholarships that lifted the city's youth toward brighter horizons, giving them wings to soar beyond the constraints of their circumstances. The irony was a bitter pill. He, the café's silent benefactor, now sought refuge in its discarded warmth, a ghost haunting the edges of his own generosity. The officers who found him saw only a trespasser, a man out of place, oblivious to the truth that he had shaped the very ground they trod upon. Langston's life was a tapestry woven with threads of valor, sacrifice, and unspoken sorrow, each stitch a testament to a man who had dared to defy the world's limitations. Born in an era when men like him were judged not by their character but by the hue of their skin, he had carved his path with a resolve that burned like a quiet flame. From 1979 to 1999, he served as a Marine, his boots pounding the earth of battlefields where courage was the only currency that mattered. In Fallujah, under a sky torn by gunfire and choked with the acrid sting of smoke, he had risked everything to save a wounded officer, dragging him through a maelstrom of chaos to the fragile promise of safety. The war left its marks, scars that crisscrossed his body like a map of survival, shadows that lingered in the corners of his mind, but it could not break him. Not then. When he returned to civilian life, Langston channeled the same unyielding discipline into a new kind of war, one fought not with weapons but with vision. He founded Equinox Innovations, a company that became a beacon of hope in a world too often shrouded in despair. Under his leadership, Equinox pioneered technologies that brought clean water to parched lands, electricity to forgotten villages, and dignity to those the world had deemed invisible. He was a trailblazer, his name a synonym for compassion and ingenuity, his presence in the boardroom as commanding as it had been on the battlefield. For a time, he seemed untouchable, a man who could bend the arc of progress to his will. But even the mightiest giants stumble, and Langston's fall was as profound as his rise. The first fracture in his world came with the death of his wife, Clara. She was his anchor, her laughter a balm for the wounds war had carved into his soul, her gentle touch a reminder that love could endure even the darkest storms. While Langston was abroad, pouring his heart into a humanitarian mission in a distant land, Clara slipped away, her life stolen by a sudden illness that left no time for goodbyes. The news struck him like a physical blow, shattering the foundations of the life he had built. Grief became a silent companion, a relentless shadow that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. The trauma of war, long buried beneath the weight of his strength, began to resurface, flashes of gunfire in the quiet of night, the weight of lives lost pressing against his dreams like a tide. He pressed on, driven by the memory of Clara's faith in him, but the world he had so carefully constructed began to fray at the seams. The final blow was betrayal, a wound deeper than any bullet could inflict. Equinox's board, men and women he had mentored, trusted, and lifted to their own heights, turned against him. They whispered of his instability, pointing to the grief and trauma that had begun to cloud his decisions, as though a man who had borne so much could be reduced to a liability. In a swift, calculated maneuver, they ousted him, stripping away his title, his purpose, and the empire he had built from nothing. The man who had once moved mountains was left with only memories and a tattered coat, his legacy rewritten by those who had forgotten his sacrifices. Society, so quick to celebrate his triumphs, turned its back on his fall, leaving him to wander the margins of a world that no longer recognized him. Now, in the courtroom, Langston was a shadow of the man he had been, his story reduced to a sterile case file, his life distilled into a litany of charges that bore no resemblance to the truth. The spectators saw only the accusations, their eyes blind to the humanity behind them. The prosecutor, a young man with a clipped voice and an air of detached efficiency, painted him as a nuisance, a drifter who had disrupted the city's carefully curated order. But the truth was heavier, richer, and infinitely more human. Langston was not a criminal, he was a casualty of a world that discards its heroes when their light begins to fade, a man whose heart had been forged in fire only to be broken by indifference. As he sat in that cold courtroom, the weight of his life pressed against him, not the weight of guilt, but the weight of a story untold. He thought of the scholarships he had funded, the children who had risen because of his belief in them, their faces a constellation of hope in his memory. He thought of Fallujah, of the officer he had carried to safety, the man's whispered thanks a reminder that some debts could never be repaid. He thought of Clara, her smile a beacon that still guided him through the darkness, even now. And he thought of Equinox, the dream he had birthed, the lives it had touched, even if its creators had forgotten the man who made it possible. The judge's gavel hung in the air, poised to deliver its verdict, but Langston's truth was larger than any ruling could contain. He was not defined by the handcuffs that bound him, nor by the charges that sought to diminish him. He was a man who had lived with courage, loved with ferocity, and given everything to a world that had not always given back. His story was not one of defeat, but of resilience, a testament to the enduring power of a heart that refuses to break, even when the world turns away. In that courtroom, Langston Reid was more than a defendant, he was a mirror, reflecting the cost of a society that forgets its own. His life, with all its triumphs and tragedies, was a call to remember, to see the humanity in those who have been cast aside, to honor the sacrifices that shape the world, even when they are no longer visible. As the proceedings unfolded, the spectators remained oblivious, their judgments as cold as the walls around them. But Langston's truth, quiet and unyielding, burned like a flame in the darkness, a reminder that heroes do not vanish, they endure, even in the shadows, waiting for the world to remember their light. The courtroom in Newbridge was a crucible of hushed anticipation, its air heavy with the weight of lives laid bare. Judge Olivia Parker presided over the proceedings, her dark robes a mantle of authority, her steady gaze a beacon of composure in a room teetering on the edge of revelation. Yet beneath her measured exterior, a tempest churned. As she opened the file before her, the name, Langston Reid, struck like a thunderbolt, piercing the veil of her judicial detachment. It was a name she knew not from court dockets or fleeting headlines, but from a story carved deep into the marrow of her heart. Her brother, Lieutenant Jack Parker, had spoken that name with a reverence reserved for the rarest of souls. In the scorched chaos of Fallujah, when death loomed like a vulture, Langston had been Jack's salvation, pulling him from the jaws of war with a courage that defied the odds. Jack had lived because of Langston's sacrifice, carrying that debt until his own life slipped away years later in a quiet tragedy that left Olivia alone with her memories. Her breath caught, a fleeting betrayal of the storm within. Olivia's mind raced, memories flooding back like a river breaching its banks. She could still see Jack's letters, his words scrawled in hurried script across crumpled pages, each one a lifeline from a battlefield that seemed a world away. Langston Reid is the kind of man who carries hope into hell, he'd written, his admiration vivid even in ink. She had spent years searching for Langston, driven by a need to thank the man who had given her brother back, if only for a time. She had imagined him as a towering figure, unbowed by the weight of his heroism. Now, here he was, not as the hero of her brother's tales, but as a defendant, his eyes hollowed by loss, his spirit frayed by a world that had turned its back. The weight of that truth pressed against her chest, a quiet ache that threatened to unravel her carefully guarded impartiality. Olivia was a judge, bound by the scales of justice, yet the humanity in her stirred, whispering that this moment demanded more than the cold application of law. The courtroom hummed with the mundane rhythms of routine, clerks shuffling papers, the prosecutor's voice droning with practiced disdain, but for Olivia, time slowed to a crawl. She saw not the frail man slumped in the defendant's chair, but the Marine who had braved a hail of bullets, the visionary who had poured his soul into lifting others, the widower whose heart had been shattered by grief. The charges, disturbing the peace, trespassing, were trivial, mere scratches on the surface of a life that had borne far heavier burdens. This was not just a case about a man lingering behind a café, it was a reckoning with a society that had failed one of its own. Langston's life had been a testament to service, each chapter written in sacrifice, yet here he stood, judged by those who could not fathom the paths he had walked. Her role demanded detachment, but her heart yearned for something greater, a justice that saw the soul before her, a compassion that could honor the man Langston had been, and still was. As the hearing unfolded, the weight of Langston's unspoken story hung in the air, a silent force that seemed to shift the room's gravity. The spectators, unaware of the depth beneath the surface, leaned forward, sensing something extraordinary stirring in the quiet drama. The prosecutor pressed his case, his words sharp and unyielding, oblivious to the currents of history and humanity swirling around him. Langston remained silent, his gaze fixed on the scarred table before him, as if he had already surrendered to a fate he could no longer fight. But Olivia saw more than a defendant. She saw a man who had given everything, his strength, his love, his dreams, and been left with nothing but the ghosts of his past. The question now was whether this courtroom, this fleeting moment, could offer him redemption or merely deepen the wounds of a life already scarred by betrayal. The air in the courtroom crackled with an electric undercurrent, the weight of unspoken stories pressing against the walls. Langston Reid sat shackled, his gaunt frame dwarfed by the cold formality of the proceedings, his eyes tracing the grain of the table as if searching for meaning in its worn surface. The charges hung like a noose, trivial yet suffocating, threatening to reduce a life of valor to a footnote in a legal ledger. Then, with a thud that silenced the room, the heavy oak doors swung open, and Alexander Ross strode in, a legal titan whose name was synonymous with power and precision. His silver hair caught the light, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the drab surroundings, and his voice, rich with the authority of decades in courtrooms, declared that he would represent Langston Reid, pro bono. The room gasped, a collective intake of breath that rippled through the gallery. Langston's head snapped up, confusion etching deeper lines into his weathered face. Why would a man like Ross, a stranger cloaked in prestige, step into the fray for him, a man the world had discarded like a worn-out coat? Langston's mind reeled, grasping for meaning in this unexpected lifeline. He did not know Ross's connection to Judge Olivia Parker, did not know that Ross had once been the law partner of Olivia's late husband, their friendship forged in late-night strategy sessions and a shared hunger for a justice that transcended the letter of the law. For Ross, this was no mere case, it was a debt to the past, a tribute to the man who had loved Olivia and the principles they had all once held dear. For Langston, though, it was a mystery wrapped in disbelief. He had long since stopped expecting kindness, let alone salvation. His hands, still bound, trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the faint stir of something he had thought lost forever, hope. The courtroom faded, and Langston's mind slipped back to a different kind of battle, one where the stakes were not charges but survival itself. 20 years ago, in the scorched streets of Fallujah, he had been a Marine, his body taut with purpose, his senses sharpened by the relentless chaos of war. The memory was vivid, as though etched in fire, a street reduced to rubble, the air thick with dust and the metallic tang of blood. Bullets screamed past, a storm of death, and there, sprawled in the dirt, was Lieutenant Jack Parker, his leg torn open, his face pale with the dawning certainty of his end. Langston did not hesitate, he acted. He sprinted through the gunfire, his heart a steady drum against the cacophony, and threw himself over Jack, shielding him as he dragged him to cover. Each step was a gamble, each breath a defiance of the odds. When they reached safety, Jack's eyes, wide with gratitude, called him a hero. Langston shook his head, his voice low and resolute. "Just my duty," he said, brushing off the weight of what he had done. To him, it was never about glory, it was about the man beside him, the life he could save. The memory dissolved, pulling Langston back to the courtroom, where Ross now stood at his side, his presence a bulwark against the prosecutor's disdain. The spectators leaned forward, sensing a shift in the narrative, but Langston's gaze remained distant, as if he could not trust the ground beneath him. The hearing paused, and Judge Olivia Parker called a recess, her voice steady but her eyes betraying the storm within. She retreated to her chambers, Ross following, the door closing softly behind them. In that private sanctuary, the weight of the moment unraveled. Olivia's composure fractured, her voice trembling as she faced Ross. "It's him, Alex," she said, her words heavy with 2 decades of searching. "Langston Reid is the man who saved Jack." She recounted the story Ross had heard only in fragments, her brother, Lieutenant Jack Parker, pulled from the jaws of death in Fallujah by a Marine whose courage defied reason. She pulled a worn letter from her desk, its edges frayed from years of handling, and read Jack's final words, written before his own life ended, "Langston Reid is the man who carried hope through hell." Olivia's eyes glistened, not with tears but with the fire of recognition. She had spent years looking for Langston, hoping to thank the stranger who had given her brother a second chance, even if it was fleeting. Now, he sat in her courtroom, not as a hero but as a defendant, his life a shadow of its former light. Ross listened, his own resolve deepening. He had taken the case as a favor to Olivia, a nod to their shared past, but now it was more, a chance to right a wrong, to honor a man whose sacrifices had been forgotten. Back in the courtroom, as the proceedings resumed, the air was charged with a new intensity. Olivia returned to the bench, her face a mask of professionalism, but her heart burned with purpose. Ross stood beside Langston, his arguments sharp and unyielding, weaving a narrative that forced the room to see the man, not the charges. The prosecutor faltered, his case crumbling under the weight of Langston's truth. Langston, still silent, felt the stirrings of a life he had thought lost. He did not know the connections that bound Olivia and Ross to him, did not know the debt they carried in their hearts. But he felt the shift, the faint possibility that this moment could be more than another round. The spectators watched, captivated, as the courtroom became a stage for something greater than law, a reckoning with humanity, a chance to see a hero not for his fall, but for the light he still carried, dimmed but never extinguished. Olivia's gavel hung in the air, poised to deliver not just a verdict, but a measure of justice that could heal as much as it judged. For Langston Reid, it was a moment to be seen, perhaps for the first time in years, as the man he had always been. In the hushed sanctity of Judge Olivia Parker's chambers, the air was thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Alexander Ross, his sharp eyes softening with the wisdom of years, watched Olivia closely, reading the conflict etched into her features, a judge bound by the ironclad vow of impartiality, a sister tethered to a debt of gratitude that spanned decades. "You could recuse yourself," he offered, his voice gentle yet resonant with the gravity of their shared history, a history forged in late-night legal battles and a mutual reverence for justice. "To avoid any question of bias." Olivia's gaze hardened, her jaw set with a resolve that seemed to draw strength from the very walls around her. She shook her head, her words slicing through the silence with the precision of a blade. "If justice is blind, then I'll be the one to open its eyes." She would not step aside, not now, not when fate had delivered Langston Reid to her courtroom. This was no mere case, it was a reckoning, a chance to honor the man who had shaped her family's story, even if he remained oblivious to the threads that bound them. In that quiet chamber, the past and present collided with a force that seemed to ripple through time itself. Olivia's mind drifted to her brother Jack's letters, his voice vivid in every hurried line, each word a testament to the Marine who had risked everything to pull him from the jaws of death in Fallujah. She could still feel the weight of those pages, their edges worn from years of quiet reverence, each one carrying Langston's name like a prayer. She thought of his fall, his company, Equinox Innovations, stolen by those he had trusted, his spirit battered by grief and betrayal, his legacy discarded by a world too quick to forget its heroes. The injustice of it burned in her chest, a quiet fire that fueled her determination. Ross nodded, his own resolve mirroring hers, his eyes reflecting a shared understanding of the cost of loyalty. He would fight for Langston, not merely as a lawyer wielding the tools of his trade, but as a man who knew the price of standing by those who had given everything. As they rose to return to the courtroom, their purpose was unspoken but unbreakable, a silent vow that this moment would be more than a legal proceeding, it would be a restoration of dignity. Langston Reid, shackled and seated in the defendant's chair, felt the shift in the air, though its source eluded him. The charges, disturbing the peace, trespassing, hung over him like a storm cloud, trivial yet oppressive, threatening to reduce a life of valor to a footnote in a cold legal ledger. Ross's presence beside him was an unexpected lifeline, a beacon in a sea of indifference, but the why of it gnawed at him. Why would a man like Ross, a legal titan cloaked in prestige, step into the fray for a man the world had cast aside? Langston's eyes, hollowed by years of loss, flicked toward Olivia on the bench. Her face was a mask of authority, her gaze steady and unyielding, yet he sensed something deeper, a flicker of recognition he could not place. He could not know that she carried his name in her heart, that she saw not a vagrant but a savior, the Marine who had braved a battlefield to save her brother, the visionary who had poured his soul into lifting others, the man whose light had dimmed but never died. To the spectators, the courtroom buzzed with the electric hum of unfolding drama, their whispers a chorus of curiosity. They leaned forward, sensing something extraordinary beneath the surface, though they could not name it. For Langston, it was simpler, more visceral, a spark of possibility, faint but undeniable, in a life that had known too much darkness. As Olivia and Ross re-entered the courtroom, the weight of their shared resolve seemed to charge the air with purpose. Langston, still unaware of the currents swirling around him, felt the stirrings of something he had long thought lost, hope, fragile yet persistent, like an ember refusing to die. The spectators' murmurs faded, their attention drawn to the quiet intensity of the moment. Olivia's eyes met Langston's, fleetingly, and though he could not know the debt she carried, he sensed a humanity in her gaze that pierced the cold formality of the proceedings. Ross stood tall beside him, his presence a shield against the prosecutor's disdain, his commitment a promise that this fight would not be Langston's alone. In that courtroom, the scales of justice trembled, poised not just to judge but to see, to recognize a man whose sacrifices had shaped lives, whose courage had carried hope through hell, and whose soul, though battered, still burned with a resilient light. For Langston Reid, it was a moment to be seen, perhaps for the first time in years, as the hero he had always been. Not all wounds bleed. Not all heroes wear medals. Langston Reid's story reminds us, sometimes, the greatest acts of courage are the ones no one sees. He lost everything, his title, his voice, his place in the world, yet never let go of his quiet dignity. And when justice finally found him, it didn't shout. It whispered, "You were never forgotten." Think about this. Who in your life has given in silence without ever being thanked? Whose quiet courage still echoes in your heart? Share their name. Share their story. Let the world remember them. And if this story moved you, subscribe to Motivation for Success. Because courage deserves to be seen.